Alright everybody, we are going to work on creating a portrait using a stippling brush. Now our goal is to have a black and white image similar to the one here on the right. This is a self-portrait that I did using a stippling brush. Stippling is when you make little tiny dots or specks on the surface of the paper instead of solid lines. And we're going to work from tracing a photograph. So I'm going to follow the instructions here. We are going to do our best to display value, that's areas of light and dark. And we need to do that by lightly or densely packing the dots in. So let's start at the beginning. We need to open a new document and place our image. So I will go to Photoshop. And as always, unless you have a good reason not to, we want to create a letter-sized document. So I'm going to go to File, New. Whoops, that popped up in my other monitor. And I will usually go to Print and grab Letter. Although if you have used Letter in the past, it will probably show up in your recent windows. So there we go. We'll need to have that letter. So name this my last name, Stippling Portrait. That'll save me a little time when it's time to save. The next step says go to File, Place, Embedded. So I'm going to place Embedded. I have to browse. I have in my Pictures folder a self-portrait that I want to use, so I'm going to bring that in. And it's going to give us a little X mark when it first comes in. And this is giving you an opportunity to change your mind or resize the image. So I'm going to drag the corners up and just try to make it as big as I can. I don't want to distort it. You want to avoid squashing and stretching, so I like to hold the Shift key when I do this. So I'll hit the check. Now I have my face nice and big, but I need to turn it into a black and white. So as the instructions will tell you, we're going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Black and White. All right, and we're actually going to make two, a black and white adjustment layer and a brightness contrast adjustment layer. So a long way to get to those adjustment layers is go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and then choose Black and White. So black and white is simply a layer that will cover your photograph and tint it with no colors involved. All right. The long way to get to the adjustment layers, or I'm sorry, the shortcut, is going to this little black and white cookie or the adjustments window, and you can look for brightness contrast. And this one you might want to play with the sliders. I'm going to increase my contrast and my brightness a bit. Good. Okay. So I think this is something that I can work with. The next step tells me I need to make a layer for my dots. So I'm going to make a new layer, Control-Shift-N, and name it Dots. I'm going to go ahead and just copy this. Copy, Dots. In Photoshop, I will go to Layer, New Layer, and I will name this layer Dots. And just paste in what I copied from before. And I may add a color code to this. I think I'll go with red. That's an arbitrary color, but it's just going to identify for me here in the layers window which layer I should really be painting on. I shouldn't be painting on any of the other layers except for the dots layer. Now, how do we go about getting dots? Well, we're going to use that stippling brush we played around with in our warm-up. B for brush, F5 for the brush options, and I just need to have, well, to start off, I'm going to turn off scatter, because I just want my brush shape to have spacing. Okay? So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with a brush that will do lines like this. Okay? Dotted lines. Now you can control the spacing. You may even want to have this up, and you can vary it as you go. Now, one of the things that I recommend you guys do is zoom in on one of your eyes and use that as the starting point. Now, when I do the dots painting, which I like to use my brush to kind of trace around the obvious areas where there are lines. So I'm tracing over this dark area, and it's really, really hard to see. I'm using black on top of a black and white image. So we're going to add a little wrinkle here. We're going to use something called a layer style. So in order to get this to show up, I'm going to go to Layer, Layer Style, and ask for Color Overlay. So you guys have seen these before. We experimented with them in earlier lessons, but I'm going to go to Layer, new layer style. There we are. Now that's for color overlay. You can pick any color that you want that will show up. For consistency's sake, I used red for tinting the actual layer. Maybe I'll ask it to be kind of a bright orange shade. So that temporarily makes my dots appear to be orange. Now this is an effect that we can hide or show by clicking the eyeball next to the effect or color overlay. So this is going to allow us to see where we have densely packed our dots. So again, I want my line to be a little tighter. I'll go over this area again. Alright, so any of the lines that are very obvious on my face, I'm going to go ahead and take the time to just kind of define them fairly well. Okay, now if I need to shrink my brush size, I can do that. You can use different sized brushes. You can also continue to adjust by pressing F5. Continue to adjust your spacing. Okay. So I'm just kind of laying out for myself the general areas on the face that will need to be defined. I'm going to add a lot more density in here. Okay. So, pack it down a little tighter. Now one thing you might realize is, hey, Mr. Hatchl, we're doing a lot of line painting, and lines are good, okay, but we also want to be able to fill some of these spaces a little bit faster, so it may help to then bring some scatter back in. So if I want my eyebrow to be darker, I can start to paint that in. And I can add more spacing to have it pack in a little less densely. And these areas that are dark, they're going to need to be pretty densely packed over time, but we can build them up. Okay? So by adding dots to the whole area in this section, I can then go back and do a second helping of dots in the darker areas to just reinforce that that needs to be more shaded. I can even trace over some of my original lines, and that will create more densely packed dots. So you'll be toggling back and forth with your shaping and your spacing. And we're going to need the pupil area to be almost completely dense. And then the iris, at least on this eye, is reading fairly dark. There's not too many light areas, so I'm going to go ahead and pack those dots in there. The white of the eye is not particularly white at this point in time. Again, when you trace over the darker areas that you've already done once, you're just reinforcing the amount of density, so that will read as dark. All right, you can use your keyboard shortcuts to shrink the brush size. It's okay to have larger and smaller brushes working together. Again, scattering, increasing the scattering. Now I'm going to scatter probably more than I needed, just the spacing. There we go. So I'm slowly adding the light and the dark here. And I'm noticing I haven't quite touched up this area of the white of the eye. It's significantly darker than the lightest parts of my face, but in this area, I'm just looking for a balance, okay? So it's okay for dots to appear in most of the image, aside from the areas that are absolutely, totally bright white. So let's see how it looks when we hide the photograph. Right? Hopefully you can see the image of the eye inside the effect emerging. Right? Zoom out, you can see it's starting to look like our face. Okay? Now I'm going to turn the photo back on, turn the effect back on, and we can branch out. And I think it's a good idea to start at your eye and kind of move outward as you go. So refresh, increase the amount of spacing and scattering. And I'm just going to start applying more dots where there are areas that need to be darker. Okay. And a good rule of thumb is look at the dark areas first and trace over those. If you want to use your tablet, either the Wacom tablet or your XP Pen tablet that you have, I recommend that you do so. A lot of times it's easier to paint an image that is done using the pencil-shaped mouse rather than a regular mouse, although you could do this with a regular mouse if you wanted. All right, when you get to areas that are more obviously lines, you don't need as much scattering and you don't need as much space. So I can make that a little more dense. So then I can go through here. Okay, again, less scattering, less space. All right. So you will find yourself going over and over the darker areas because ideally the darkest areas of our image will get covered up with the density of the dots. Right? And the pupil itself is really dark, so that may be almost solid. Right? So I can increase, decrease the size of my brush. Again, we're going to play with scatter. Add a little more. So I'm going to need more space. Maybe not that much, but. Right, so I see that there is a kind of a shaded area here. I'm just going to go over it, try to densely pack it in. Now, passing over it once, passing over it twice, maybe adjust my spacing or my scattering. And you can see how that's going to change the character of the line. All right, this takes a while. Don't rush it. Try to just look at it like an exercise in value. Just like we did with the value chart, we're trying to represent areas of light and dark. Okay, I might even identify individual hairs that are part of my eyebrow. All right, so this is the thing that you'll play with mixing. Try to capture that line. Any distinct lines on my face, I'll go ahead and try to identify them. Okay. So let's see, how are we doing? I like to, first I haven't saved in a while, I ought to save it right on my desktop in my demonstration folder. So I can hide the effect, hide the photo, and then you can see the progress as it's coming along. Okay. Turn it back on. The major thing I want you to make sure you don't paint on the picture layer. Okay? We want to leave the picture layer all alone so that your dots are isolated because we're going to hide the picture layer for our final product. Okay? Again, when you're painting dense areas, it's okay to have a lot less spacing. So this area below my nose is almost entirely a shadow. So I can pack those dots in nice and tight. Right, now when you follow the contours of the image underneath, if I paint in the direction that my mustache is headed, well, that's going to translate when you look at it with the image off. And when we want to have something for line quality that is a little tighter, in fact, I may turn off scattering entirely and just play with my spacing. I need to get a very distinct line like the one in this eye up here. But I like the scattering, even if it's just a mild amount, to create a little bit of wiggle in how the line is applied. And if you are comfortable, again, using your Wacom tablet or your XP pen, I think that that will make this a somewhat easier exercise. Just pack those in nice and tight. And the pupil's going to be very dense. So again, you can also use larger brushes. Feel free to adjust your brush size on the fly. Okay. And the eyes are a big selling point when you're doing a portrait. It's always good to put most of your attention to detail on the eyes because we're going to look at the eyes and hopefully see a little bit of highlight, like a shiny area, that makes the face kind of appear alive and really does a good job of selling vitality to the viewer. Okay, so going over the lines again. There are lines I can trace around the outside of my eyebrow if I wanted to, but I think it's also a good idea. Get in there with your scattered brush. And if it's dense, let it be dense. So I'm building up these areas of light and dark. slowly over time. So we'll hide it until it's starting to come through. See, that's what it looks like with black and white. Turn the color back on, turn the photo visibility back on. And I can start to paint over this entire area because this whole thing is getting a bit of shading. I'm lit from the top, so there's shadows under my eyes, so I can go over the entire thing with a little bit of a scattered brush. In the areas where I already painted, well, they're just going to become more dense anyhow, so it's okay for them to get touched just a little bit. And then I can adjust my spacing, back in. Alright, now I always try to follow the contours of my face, because I think that's going to do a good job selling the form. All right, the area of light and dark, that's all kind of working towards selling this as a three-dimensional face. Okay, we want it to look like it's in shadow. Okay? Hopefully the nose appears like it's going to pop out over time. And we just got to go slow and add our dots. Remember, you can change your brush size. You don't ever want to go super big, but use your keyboard shortcut, bracket keys, to change your brush size, or you can just use the slider, adjust your spacing, and adjust your scattering so that you end up with density where you need it. Okay, so I'm looking at this, I can see that some of these dark areas are still poking through. I really want the darkest areas covered with orange. That's just my scatter and my spacing a little more. Now there's a pretty distinct thing going on down here under my nose. So I'm going to go ahead and put a little scatter on the brush. Try my best to give that a little bit of form there. Because there's not any truly solid areas other than light and dark. But again, we're going to go slow, build it up over time. You're going to have many class periods to work on this. I think I'm going to give you guys almost 4.5 hours collectively to work on this project. So let's save as we go. And if you have questions for me, don't be shy.